September 14, 1945. Camp Hearn, Texas. The convoy shuddered to a stop just inside the barbed wire gates, and the dust hung in the late afternoon heat like a curtain no breeze would lift. In the canvas, covered truck beds sat 43 German women, gray uniforms stiff with salt and sweat, faces hollowed by weeks of rumor and rations. A young American sergeant stepped forward, clipboard leveled in his hands, voice flat, and practiced as he called the first 10 names. Boots hit the red Texas dirt. A line formed, rigid, silent. Then the order that froze their blood inside. Undress. Before we go further, if you are watching from Germany, Texas, or anywhere in between, hit like and tell us where you are tuning in from. A story buried for decades in military archives is reaching a global audience tonight. History connects us all. Back at the doorway, steam feathered from vents along the roofline. No jeers, no cameras, just the threshold and the rules beyond it. And for one woman, Annalisa Kruger, that realization would haunt her more than hate ever could. Propaganda had done its work long before Texas heat pressed through their uniforms. In the cramped classrooms and blared broadcasts of a collapsing Reich, the women had been fed a steady script. The Americans will strip you, parade you, photograph you, carve your shame into souvenirs. Those leaflets, cartoons of leering geese and weeping women, had the force of nightmares. They traveled easily, smuggled in pockets and memory. And on the long voyage west, they swelled into certainty. 3 weeks of ocean and continent had narrowed life to routine cold bread, thin beans, coffee that tasted like rusted iron, a Red Cross observer gliding past with a notebook that seemed to record everything and nothing. In the hammocks above the hold, exhaustion smelled of diesel and salt and fear that would not sleep. Annalisa Kruger, 23, former Luftwaffe radio operator out of Hamburg, counted time in heartbeats and rumors. Beside her on the truck that afternoon, a nurse moved her lips in a prayer too soft to hear. Another woman, jaw locked, hissed, "Do not give them the satisfaction." The line shuffled forward, boots printing the red dirt that clung like guilt. The order repeated inside, and it was as if every poster and whispered warning rose up to meet them at the threshold. But beyond the door was not humiliation staged as theater. The air smelled of antiseptic and wet wood. Tin buckets nested under hooks, hoses coiled like sleeping snakes. Steam climbed from vents in steady breaths. 3 American nurses, white uniforms, clipboards, hair-pinned with the same exactness as their tone gestured to benches with a practiced economy. "Clothes here," one said in accented German. "There's shower through that door. Take your time." The words were ordinary, almost dull, and their very ordinariness cracked something that fear had sealed shut. Annalisa's hands shook as she folded her jacket, then her shirt, then the remainder of the uniform that had once announced rank and allegiance. She waited for the camera flash that never burst, for catcalls that never came. The water ran warm. That was the first shock heat on skin that had learned to expect cold. Soap foamed with the faintest of lavender, a scent so domestic it felt like a memory smuggled into a war. Towels were rough but clean. A nurse pressed a small bar of soap into Annalisa's palm and said, almost apologetically, "For you. Keep it." She searched the woman's face for mockery and found only routine. Not mercy as performance. Not hatred in uniform procedure. Outside, the same windless sun, the same guard towers. Inside, the bare mechanics of hygiene, recorded and repeatable. Annalisa understood something she would later struggle to name. The Americans did not need cruelty to make their point. The point was already made by the steam, the forms, the fact that nobody looked away and nobody lingered. Defeat arrived without a raised voice, delivered in the bland language of order. And order, she realized with a tremor she could not stop, could be the most terrifying victor of all. By the summer of 1945, Europe's thunder had gone quiet. Rubble did the talking. The Third Reich lay in pieces, its ministries charred, its banners ash, its armies dissolved into surrendering columns. Across the Atlantic, the United States was tending to victory's unglamorous aftermath. 425,000 German prisoners of war distributed through more than 500 camps in 46 states. Most were men, infantrymen, with mud still baked into their boots. U-boat crews pale from depth and silence, tank mechanics whose hands remembered the weight of armored plates. Threaded through the rosters, half hidden behind the masculine mass, were approximately 2,500 women, clerks who had typed orders into movement, radio operators who stitched messages across ruined skies, telephone switchboarders, nurses, civilian auxiliaries who had worn the uniform and kept the machine oiled. The net had been wide. As Allied forces moved through France and the Low Countries, they gathered anyone tied to the Wehrmacht apparatus. Names were tagged, faces photographed, files opened with the same relentless neatness that characterized the rest of the Allied advance. The women were told they would be treated under the Geneva Convention. Few believed it. They came from a system that praised hardness as a virtue and framed pity as a flaw in that moral geometry. Defeat usually ended with annihilation, not rules. Transit was monotony sharpened into edge. 17 days at sea, in hammocks that rocked to a rhythm older than politics. Diesel and vomit thickened the air until each hour felt preserved in oil. Twice a day, the line for bread and beans. Twice a day, the coffee that rasped like rust. A doctor counted pulses once a week and moved on. Red Cross observers drifted through with notebooks, quiet as snow. Recording or appearing to record, no one could tell which was worse. In New York and New Orleans, docks rose like black ribs from the water. The women were divided by list and alphabet, funneled into rail cars whose windows wore painted shades. America rolled past on a screen the color of dust. The cars were hot, the air heavy. 3 days into the interior, the country felt less like a place than a rumor of spaces, fields unbombed, small towns with paint that had not blistered under fire, mountains that did not know occupation. Through a bend in a torn shade, Annalisa saw children playing baseball, blue sky ringing with a crack of wood on leather. They do not even know we exist, she thought, and the idea stung more than hostility might have. The furnace door opened in Texas. Heat slapped first, then the geometry of custody, barracks marching in rows, towers at attention, a flag that hung limp because the wind had nothing left to say. Near the gate stood Major Robert Kellogg, 42, North Africa veteran, a career officer whose posture matched the grit of the place. His doctrine traveled light. Follow Geneva to the letter. No improvisation, no sentiment. The procedure was the whole sermon. Under Kellogg, even decency became a checklist. Intake, hygiene, rations, medical, assignment. Not because he was gentle, but because gentleness properly scheduled kept the machine from grinding its own teeth. Processing began the way storms do. First a pressure change, then a sequence you can't interrupt. 10 at a time. The women moved through the long wooden building with the corrugated roof, each space divided as neatly as a filing cabinet. Undress, showers, inspection, reissue. The air held the sting of antiseptic and the warm breath of steam escaping through roof vents. Inside, Annalisa braced herself for spectacle and found, instead, a choreography practiced until it had no edges. A nurse with tired eyes and schoolroom German tapped the bench. "Clothes here," she said. "There's shower through that door. Take your time." The words were almost boring, and in their boredom, disarming. Lavender rose from the soap like a memory of peacetime smuggled past the guards. Water ran warm, not punitive but deliberate, as if the pipes themselves understood the instruction manual. Towels were rough, honest fabric. A comb appeared in a clean hand. A palm-sized bar of soap was pressed into Annalisa's own. "For you," the nurse said. "Keep it." Annalisa searched the face for mockery and found only a professional weariness. Shift work, not theater. She felt her body unknot by degrees she had not known were tied. They emerged to a row of uniforms. Gray U.S. Army fatigues. Stenciled with the blunt letters PW. No rank, no insignia. Just a number on the chest pocket. A name replaced by a system that did not need to say please to be obeyed. The fabric scratched at first, and then, as the body remembered what clean meant, settled. Annalisa looked down and whispered the truth that felt heavier than steel. We belong to the rules now. Outside, the sun lay on the compound like a weight. Inside, the line moved to the mess hall, where trays slid across a steel counter with a satisfying rattle. White bread, beef stew, thick enough to coat the spoon. Black coffee that steamed instead of scolded. The portions were not generous out of kindness. They were adequate by design. No one balked. No one rushed them. At a long, wooden table, Annalisa tasted meat that registered almost as pain after months of scarcity. Across from her, Erna, the nurse who had prayed, stared at her plate. "Maybe this is worse," she whispered. Shame through kindness. But the word was not kindness. It was efficiency. The system spoke in Kellogg's ledgers more eloquently than any speech. Gallons of water accounted, lice counts dropping by the week, sick call tallied, caloric intake squared against labor. The lesson was simple and devastating. Starving prisoners breed disease. Disease breeds chaos. Chaos breeds work, stoppage and headlines, and blame. Clean camps. Stay quiet. Fed prisoners work. Paperwork prevents scandal. If a warm shower felt like mercy, it was because the machine had learned the value of lubrication. Still, the effect did not care about motives. Bodies remembered comfort before they remembered slogans. The women loosened around the edges of their fear. The regimen drilled itself into muscle memory line, tray, table, bunk, until predictability began to feel like a fragile kind of peace. In that peace, defeat stopped shouting and started filing reports. Routine, when fully assembled, sounds like a clock. At Camp Hearn, it began at 0600, with the bugle, 3 bright notes over red soil, followed by roll call that counted not only bodies, but order itself. Breakfast came on time enough to be trusted, porridge that stuck to the ribs, coffee that smoked in the cool of early light, bread sliced with indifferent precision. Then the compound divided into its daily currents. Laundry crews hauled baskets that steamed in the morning air, turning stacks of soiled cloth into flat, sun-struck order. Kitchen details peeled potatoes by the crate, wrists finding a rhythm that could almost be mistaken for music. A handful of women reported to the camp hospital, assisting medics with inventory and paper thermometers tallied, bandages logged. The small arithmetic of health performed without ceremony. The work was dull by design and safe by consequence. For it, each woman earned 80 cents a day in camp script currency that could not leave the wire, but could, within it, change a life's temperature by a few degrees. At the canteen, script turned into cigarettes, postcards, soap, pencils, the occasional chocolate square if you arrived before the tray ran out. Annalisa bought writing paper first. She learned the weight of the camp's envelopes, the way the gum on the flap tasted faintly chemical. She learned the exact angle a pen must hold to keep the ink from bleeding. The habit of scarcity lingered, she wrote. Small, as if saving space might save time. Inspections punctuated the days like commas. One afternoon, a Red Cross observer walked the barracks. A tidy man with a practiced smile and a notebook that felt both comforting and accusatory. He checked bunks and latrines. Paused to ask in careful German, "Are you treated fairly?" Annalisa, surprised to hear her own voice sound steady, said, "Better than we expected." He nodded, wrote something impossible to read upside down, and passed on. The sentence followed her back to the bunk, like an echo. Better than we expected. How cruelly low the bar had been set, that ordinary decency rang like luck. Kellogg's reports kept time in another register. They read like balance sheets for a factory that produced calm 3,200 inmates. 0 disciplinary incidents this week. 4,500 gallons of water used daily. Lice infestation down 93% in 2 weeks. Each line item was a trapdoor beneath panic. The numbers did not glow with virtue. They hummed with function. The United States Army, chastened by the last war, had learned the math: starve a prisoner and you invite disease. Invite disease and you invite headlines. Invite headlines and you invite inquiries that waste fuel, paper, and careers. Feed prisoners and they work. Wash prisoners, and the camp does not itch itself into chaos. Provide rules, and the rules will do the speaking, so the guards do not have to. The Reich had revered order while practicing brutality. Hearn practiced order while refusing brutality. The distinction worked like sandpaper on the soul. You could not hate a checklist. You could only obey it or fail to, and the consequence for failure was more checklist. Annalisa found herself breathing with the compound's metronome. She no longer flinched at every shouted name. Most names were no longer shouted. She knew when stew ran thin and when fresh towels appeared, could tell by the angle of the sun how many trays remained ahead of her in the line. At night, the towers clicked on, pale cones of light washing the ground. Aid from her bunk, Annalisa listened to the water pump's cadence, the camp's heart thudding through pipes, the soft talk in German and halting English braided across the aisle. Peace did not feel like forgiveness. It felt like sameness, day after day, sanding the sharp edges down until fear could not find purchase. Order, repeated, became indistinguishable from kindness, and in that indistinguishability, the lesson kept writing itself in the margins. This was how the Americans won, by organizing the air you breathed. Erna Vuber arrived like a blade, 31. Former SS communications officer, captured outside Munich, still buttoned into black. Her posture announced a war that existed for her, even with the armistice ink dry. Her eyes refused to register the grid of barracks as anything but an enemy's trick. Intake tried its choreography, and she refused the steps. She spat during inspection, stood rigid when told to undress, called the American nurses cowards in a German that cracked like ice. The guards did not tighten the vise. They wrote her name, underlined a word in a file uncooperative, and moved the line forward. The punishment, infuriatingly, was time. 2 weeks she made a show of stillness, ate only when forced, worked not at all, stared through orders as though words were insects hitting glass. The camp had patience, because the camp had procedure. One morning, Patience wore a stateside face and carried 2 cups of coffee. Sergeant Eleanor, Fielding, Michigan schoolteacher turned interpreter, sat across from Erna and placed a cup within reach. No sermon in her hands, just heat, and a lidless stare that belonged to classrooms where the unteachable were taught anyway. "You were in communications," Fielding said in German. "Good enough to be mistaken for respect. We need translators." Erna laughed once, a hard syllable. "Help you." "Help yourself," Fielding replied, and there was no threat in it, only arithmetic. The first assignment was mechanical. Translate letters drifting between wire and ruin. Mothers in Bremen asking, after sons reported missing before Christmas. Wives in Cologne writing in a grammar buckled by grief. Fathers who had no address for their boys anymore, except United States of America, and the hope that a letter could cross an ocean the way a prayer crosses sleep. Erna read them aloud to herself at first. Old habits of radio checking her cadence, then rendered them into English that put sorrow into a cleaner line. Somewhere between my little one is febrile. Have you medicine? And our street is gone, but our table survived. Something inside her softened, not conversion. Exactly. More an admission that words did not salute uniforms. Her file changed in Kellogg's neat hand from uncooperative to valuable. The word felt both insulting and accurate, like being called a wrench. She began teaching English in the evenings to women who wanted to write their own replies beyond the phrases dictated by translators. The class met under a bulb that hummed, chalk squeaking through pronouns. "Good morning," they repeated until the greeting felt less like surrender and more like mouth exercise on the far side of catastrophe. Sometimes Fielding sat in the back and corrected nothing. Nights, Erna drifted to the yard's fringe and watched the towers carve triangles of light into the dust. "They do not need to remind us who won," she told a woman beside her. "Neither friend nor enemy, just adjacent. The rules do that for them." Beyond the fence, crickets worked the darkness. Within it, the camp kept its steady exhale, lights timed, pumps thudding, lockers closing. Victory had many flags, she realized. Here, it wore a desk lamp and a ledger. It did not pound its chest. It signed forms. It filed copies. And inside that quiet bureaucracy, she felt the first reluctant relief of someone who has stopped bracing for a blow that does not come. When letters returned, thin envelopes with American postmarks and a sudden, ordinary dear at the top, Erna watched faces change as if a window had opened where a wall used to be. The Reich had trained her to believe compassion was weakness. Here, compassion was scheduled, notarized, receipted. Standing in the wash of the guard tower lights, she let the strangeness settle. The enemy's system had made room for her usefulness and, in doing so, pared her defiance down to something workable. She would never call it mercy, but she could name it, finally, by the glow that fenced the night, order without cruelty. Paperwork had teeth. You could not see them until you felt the bite. Small and decisive, closing around every hour. The engine behind Camp Hearn's calm was older than the war and broader than any one nation. The Geneva Convention of 1,929 minimum rations, humane treatment, medical care, protection from public curiosity. It read like a dry promise until Major Kellogg enforced it with the zeal of a bookkeeper. Not every guard was virtuous. The system simply left them no other option. The emotion was inefficiency. Cruelty was liability. And the machinery of forms, signatures, inspections, receipts. This was how order became policy, rather than personality. For the women, the shock was cultural as much as carceral. They had been raised in an order that preached steel and practiced humiliation. Here the order preached nothing and practiced consistency. Hot water at appointed hours. Lights out at appointed hours. Work details posted. Pay script counted. Infirmary charts clipped to the foot of each bed. They defeat us, not by hating us, Annalisa wrote in her notebook with cramped care, but by organizing us. She underlined the sentence once, then looked at it as though it might look back. Autumn fretted into winter. December arrived, wearing a thin Texas chill. Enough for breath to show, not enough for frost. The chaplain set up a makeshift altar and ran services in both German and English. The same words refracted through different mouths. The Red Cross came with parcels that felt like contraband from a world that remembered Sundays, chocolate rationed into squares that snapped, playing cards that made shuffling sound like rain, hymn sheets folded into careful thirds. Someone cut stars from paper and pinned them between bunks. On Christmas Eve, the loudspeaker offered Stille Nacht and then Silent Night, the melody traveling the wire as if it were a line on a map that the war had never torn. Annalisa stood by the fence, fingers tucked into sleeves, and listened. Germany rose in her mind as a city of absence, Hamburg reduced to outlines and ash. She thought of the first warm shower, the bar of lavender soap the nurse had pressed into her hand, the rough towel that did not insult her skin. The inventory of small decencies arranged itself into an argument she could not refute. A camp could hold you and still refuse to strip you. The same schedules that flattened you also steadied you. Order without cruelty. Someone had said. In the music's spill across the yard, the phrase gathered shape. This was not kindness as theater. No one asked the women to applaud. The guards were not saints. They were instruments of a doctrine that equated predictability with peace. And yet results cared nothing for motive. Fear eroded when it met routine. Dignity, starved for spectacle, ate what it was given and found it sustaining. You could feel the paradox in the mess hall line, in the hospital ledger, in the way tower lights clicked on without flourish, empathy not as impulse but as schedule. By the time New Year's passed, forms changed again. New columns opened in Kellogg's reports. Repatriation rosters, medical clearances, transport timetables scribbled into tidy columns. The same system that had captured them now prepared to release them, stamped and documented, their departure arranged with the same indifferent care as their arrival. Annalisa folded her notebook and slid it under her pillow. The war, she had learned, ended twice. First with silence over battlefields, then with order in places like this. And the second ending, she suspected, would follow her longer. Pring 1946 loosened the latches. The same offices that had written intake files now stamped exits. The same fingers that tallied rations tallied departures. The gates did not swing dramatically. They opened on a schedule, Medical clearances were inked in rows, chest X-rays clipped to folders, vaccinations recorded with neat ticks, names transferred to transport rosters, rosters to train manifests. The pencil lines crisp as rails. Annalisa found her own letters, marching alongside strangers, in Kellogg's final reports, columns converging toward the Atlantic. She packed what little could be called hers, a folded PW fatigue shirt, a comb with missing teeth, the small notebook where she had taught herself to write quietly enough for history. The train to New York jittered the way all goodbyes do. Through a clean window this time, America rolled past in full-color fields with green insisting on itself. Towns whose storefront glass had never tasted blast. Billboards that hawked pleasures without apology. She saw boys on bicycles chase nothing in particular and realized the luxury of aimless speed. At the pier, an officer handed her a paper ticket, stamped with the bloodless grace of bureaucracy. Released under convention. "Good luck, miss," he said. She considered gratitude and found the word too soft for the ledger that had held her. She nodded instead, an agreement between two citizens of procedure. Across the ocean, Germany waited in ruins, streets that ended where fire had decided, rooms open to weather, families stitched together from what remained. What she carried back weighed nothing and would not burn. It was an arrangement of ideas, that rules could be built to resist humiliation. That decency, when made habitual, worked like architecture. That a nation could win without learning to sneer. In her notebook, she wrote the sentence that had followed her from the steam of that first shower. They did not forgive us. They organized us, and somehow that was enough. Years later, when the archives unlocked their drawers, historians ran fingers along the math that had quietly governed Camp Hearn. 425,000 German POWs across the United States. About 2,500 women threaded through those lists. Lice infestation, reduced by 93% in 2 weeks. 0 recorded assaults. An escape rate so slim, 0.02%, it read like a rounding error to the chaos of war. The ledgers did not boast. They testified, not to benevolence, exactly, but to the radical idea that discipline could be engineered toward decency, and that such engineering held better than fear. In the last pages of her notebook, Annalisa tried to choose a word in German for what she had witnessed. Ordnung ohne Hass. Order without hate. It landed awkwardly on the tongue. A phrase too simple for a machine so intricate. She settled, finally, on a memory instead. The mornings they made us wash. Soap as salvation, routine as mercy. She understood now that the war ends twice. First in the tremor of surrender, then in the slow signing of forms that restore predictability to human breath. The first is loud and ends abruptly. The second is quiet and never really finishes. On the ship's deck, wind worried the edge of her ticket. The water looked endless in every direction but forward. She closed the notebook and, for the first time in years, did not brace for the camera flash that never came. "They did not hate us," she wrote on the inside cover. The line she could not escape and would not erase. That is how they won.